HBO's The Last of Us. It's a visually impressive show with good effects and an interesting story that mostly held water. It's well acted with a good cast, including Pedro Pascal from Game of Thrones and Bella Ramsey, also from Game of Thrones, so it had a lot going for it. On the flip side, I found it quite depressing, and that kind of ruined my enjoyment of it. We've just had several years of pandemic lockdowns. Is it really too much to ask for something cheerful to watch? So, should you watch HBO's The Last of Us? It's well made, there's not much wrong with it, and it's very emotive in places, but sadly the emotion that it tends to invoke is a bleak sense of loss, and I'm just not looking for something to depress me at this moment. Why now? What was the thinking behind releasing this show? Lots of people just lost relatives in a pandemic, so here everyone, have a show about a pandemic. Who greenlit this? So if you should watch it depends largely on you. Do you want to have a cast of characters that you may well grow to like, well acted for the most part, in a somewhat believable setting, an interesting story to have you grow to like them, and then watch them all die in upsetting and tragic circumstances? If that sounds like something that you don't want to watch, then you have your answer. But if that does interest you, maybe go and watch the series before I get into spoilers. Then maybe come back and watch the rest of this review, and maybe all of my other videos. Subscribe, you know, that sort of thing. But for me, this show was not what I needed at all. So what is The Last of Us? The Last of Us is a 2013 action-adventure game that released on PlayStation. What is it to me? Not a lot really. It was a game I never played, and at first I wasn't even going to review the series because of that, but I got to thinking that that was a perspective of its own. I didn't have baggage going into the series. I just caught some of the arguments and controversy about the series second hand. In the plot, an outbreak of a mutant cordyceps fungus ravages the United States, transforming its human hosts into aggressive creatures known as the infected. All it takes is one bite to infect someone. The effect is permanent and incurable. It either consumes the host or turns them into a fungus zombie, and the zombies are pretty creepy. 20 years after the pandemic, there's not much of humanity left. Civilization has been destroyed by the infection. Survivors live in totalitarian quarantine zones, independent settlements and nomadic groups. And these groups, as depicted in the show, kind of don't work, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to say, because much like Witcher Blood Origin, the creatives do not seem to grasp what it takes for humanity to survive. You can't just take part of a city and put a wall around it. People need to eat. Humans need food and clean fresh water, and I think many people, including the makers of this, would be shocked at just how much land and how many crops it takes to feed one person for a year. Every spare scrap of ground inside the walls would be dedicated to growing the food that the people needed to survive. They can't go out of the walls because the infection never died out. It doesn't always kill the host. Some of the infected lie dormant for decades, like zombies. They live, if it can be called life, and continue trying to spread the infection to more people. The main plot revolves around the character Joel Miller being played by Pedro Pascal, and Ellie being played by Bella Ramsey, which is a bit of a class reunion from Game of Thrones, that they were in together but probably never even met, with Pedro playing Oberyn Martell and Bella playing Lyanna Mormont. Joel is a smuggler in one of these quarantine zones, and the penalty for breaking the quarantine is hanging. When the infection hit, the government became authoritarian. Well, more authoritarian. And there is an armed group rebelling against the government called the Fireflies. Joel is tasked by the Fireflies with smuggling Ellie out of the Boston quarantine zone and taking her to a rendezvous outside the zone. It turns out Ellie has been bitten by one of the zombies, but unlike everyone else, she survived. The Fireflies want to take her to their lab across the country to look for a cure for the infection, but when Joel gets to the rendezvous, The fireflies have all expired already. So Joel resolves to take Ellie cross country to find the lab and get Ellie to it. The show opens on a prologue on a talk show with two scientists talking about disease, one warning about the threat humanity faces from fungus. The two scientists are played by John Hannah and Christopher Heyerdahl, both of whom I like. John Hannah for many things, including the Mummy films and Spartacus Blood and Sand, and Christopher Heyerdahl for his role in Hell on Wheels and a lot of sci-fi work including Sanctuary and the Stargate franchise. So the show was off to a good start for me. And then they were never in it again. We then cut to the start of The Infection, where Pascal's Joel Miller is an ex-soldier working as a contractor with his brother Tommy and raising a daughter, Sarah, being played by Nico Parker, who I was interested to find is Tandy Newton's daughter, or Tandiwe Newton as she likes to go by now. You may know her from Westworld or from Mission Impossible 2. They're struggling to get by and then the infection hits. The fungus is in the food supply and infects a large number of people worldwide all at once, and the streets are filled with infected zombies biting people. Joel, Tommy and Sarah try to run, but the government has instituted quarantine, and when they're caught, a soldier is going to shoot them, infected or not. The soldier shoots, but is stopped by Tommy. Not before, however, he fatally shoots Sarah. Time then advances 20 years and Joel has moved from Texas to Boston and is now living in a quarantine zone where he meets Ellie and the story proper begins. Joel trying to get Ellie to where she needs to go. What are the best and worst parts of the show? I've watched the 3 available episodes at time of recording, and the best part for me was probably Nick Offerman in episode 3 playing Bill. They have another flashback to the start of The Infection where the government is taking people away. Bill is a survivalist prepper, so when the soldiers come to take everyone from his town, he hides in a homemade bunker full of guns, and that probably saves his life. When the soldiers leave, he comes out and starts to turn the town into his own little world, complete with an electrified perimeter fence, defences, his own food supply, and I'm really getting into the show at this point. It's what I'd do in that situation, and it reminds me a lot of Dawn of the Dead. This is what they seem to be drawing on, where a group of survivors make a home in an abandoned mall while under siege by zombies. Dawn of the Dead is a fantastic film. Watch that frankly instead of this. In fact, if you like the genre, watch them all. Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead. Just maybe skip Land of the Dead. It's sadly nowhere near as good. So Bill is living his best life, or so he thinks, until a human falls into one of his pit traps, a man named Frank, and Bill is very tempted to shoot Frank at first. Bill is not the trusting type, but in the end he takes pity on Frank, who hasn't eaten in 2 days, and gives him clean clothes, a shower and good food. Rabbit with fresh vegetables and a Beaujolais, and the two of them bond while playing Linda Ronstadt on a piano. And it's a bit abrupt, but they kiss and go to bed together.
What are you, gay?
Yes they are. So there is lots of LGBT representation in The Last of Us, so that only makes this series, and pretty much everything else to come out of Hollywood in the last 20 years. I would have maybe done this all a bit differently. I maybe would have had Frank twist an ankle or break a leg while falling into the pit, so Bill had to take care of him. This would have given them a bit more time together instead of going to bed together on day 1. There's also maybe a bit too much beard in the love scene for me, but Bill and Frank stay together and the episode plots their life over the next 20 years. And from the reception, this has been quite a divisive episode, with some people upset about the inserted politics, some people loving it for the same reason, some upset that it was not true to the source material, but for what it is, it's one of the better gay romances I've ever seen in entertainment, even if it still feels a bit bolted on. The couple get to know and work with Joel. At one point, Bill gets shot by raiders because for a survivalist, he has a shockingly bad concept of the use of cover. And their story ends when Frank gets ill and finally gets confined to a wheelchair as they both get older, and Frank decides to end his own life. He plans the perfect day with Bill. They get married. Bill cooks rabbit with fresh vegetables and a Beaujolais, and Frank has wine with crushed up pills, and unbeknownst to Frank, Bill has taken them too, and they end their lives together. They go to bed and drift off together, and sadly, I found this morbid and really upsetting. My life has not been so tragedy free that I want more tragedy bringing into it. I don't want it in my entertainment too. Thanks, I hate it. So I did quite a tame review on The Last of Us, and then it turns out that the director of episode 3 of The Last of Us is quoted in a story in The Independent saying that he wanted to trick viewers into watching episode 3's gay romance. Speaking to Inverse about the third episode of The Last of Us, the director said, "Sometimes you have to sort of trick the rest of the world into watching these things before they're like, oh my god, it was two guys, I just realised." And I went back and rewrote the review just to add this part. Because who the hell do you think you are? Both the people behind this show and HBO. HBO, people are paying you for your entertainment service, and instead you give them a bait and switch, the purpose of which does not seem to be to entertain, but instead to propagandise. As for the director of this episode, who I understand is a gay man, here's an idea. If you want more acceptance for gay people, maybe try being less sodding creepy. This series has gone out of its way to bait and switch viewers, and it's manipulative and offensive. And I really don't like people trying to manipulate me. It's abusive. You want what you want as a creative, and to hell with the viewer's informed consent. You've intentionally tried to avoid getting people's consent. So no, I don't think people are going to watch this and think it's just two gay guys. I think there's a very good chance people are going to watch this and think the gay director is a manipulative creep with a very dubious view on consent. This is frankly insanely toxic and disrespectful to your audience. HBO at this point seem to be doing their very best to dumpster their own reputation. This is the third thing from HBO that I've reviewed recently. I just looked at Velma and its toxic levels of racism, and before that, House of the Dragon and its weird obsession with, let's call it, familial love, where we had an uncle trying to seduce his own underage niece. And I'm starting to get the idea that watching HBO as a network is no longer a safe proposition. So yes, the show is very well executed, but complimenting that to me feels like complimenting the gracefulness of someone's run-up as they're about to kick me in the balls.
Stop it. Get some help.